Welcome to the entire history of the House of Borgia, the church's most twisted dynasty. They weren't just the Mafia. They were a family who believed their blood was so divine, it should only ever remain within the bloodline. Forget your prayers, because the Borgia Vatican was a place where the Pope presided over nights of unspeakable hedonism, and that is the very definition of corruption. And that stench of rot rose most pungently in the summer of 1492, when Rome revealed itself not as a holy land, but as a decomposing corpse, where human life was cheaper than dirt and bodies were discarded like trash along the plague-ridden banks of the Tiber. But the true abomination wasn't in the sewers. It was perched right on top of the glittering Vatican Hill. There, in the suffocating viscous heat of the Sistine Chapel, Rodrigo Borgia turned the sanctuary of God into a black market of flesh. No saints were summoned, only a naked transaction, where Rodrigo used mules laden with silver to buy the souls of greedy cardinals. He won the most immoral auction in history to ascend the throne, not as a shepherd, but as a ravenous wolf, leaving all of Rome trembling in fear before an era where the church officially became a plaything in the hands of the devil. Pope Alexander VI wasted no time in confirming their worst fears. In previous centuries, popes who had illegitimate children, and there were many, had the decency to be ashamed of them. They called them nephews or nieces. They hid them in the countryside. They maintained a veil of hypocrisy. Rodrigo Borgia tore that veil down and trampled on it. He was the first pope in history to openly, publicly, and proudly acknowledge his bastards. He didn't just support them, he paraded them. He moved his children, Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, and Joffrey, directly into the Vatican. Pious pilgrims arriving in Rome expected monks in silent prayer. Instead, they found a Spanish court, loud, vibrant, and utterly secular, installed in the apostolic palace. The halls where saints were supposed to walk now echoed with the laughter of the Pope's children, the rustle of silk dresses, and the arguments of a dysfunctional family. It ceased to be a holy place. It became a domestic residence, a Spanish court transplanted into the heart of Italian power. But the corruption of Alexander VI went deeper than just nepotism. It was carnal. Rodrigo was a man of insatiable, almost pathological appetites. He loved food, he loved festivals, but above all, he loved women. He was a man who could not sleep alone. Shortly after becoming pope, he installed his mistress, Julia Farnese, in a palace right next to St. Peter's. Julia was 19 years old. The Pope was 62. The Romans, with their biting wit, gave her a nickname, Sponsa Christi, the Bride of Christ. It was a blasphemous joke, but it was true. The relationship was shockingly public. Julia was married to a man named Orsino Orsini, a weak, pathetic figure who was bullied into silence. But when Orsino eventually tried to reclaim his wife, the Pope, the leader of the Christian faith, threatened to excommunicate him. He used the spiritual weapon of eternal damnation to keep a teenager in his bed. The audacity of it was staggering. Alexander VI commissioned paintings in the Vatican apartments. In one fresco, the Virgin Mary is depicted holding the baby Jesus, but when courtiers looked closely at the face of the Virgin, they didn't see a holy icon. They saw the face of Julia Farnese. The Pope was literally kneeling and praying to the image of his own mistress. The sacred and the profane were not just mixed, they were fused together. However, if Julia was the object of his lust, she was not the center of his world. That place was reserved for his children. And this is where the story shifts from simple corruption to something darker, something psychological. Rodrigo Borgia loved his children with a ferocity that was terrifying to behold. It was not the nurturing love of a father. It was the possessive, hoarding love of a dragon guarding its gold. He saw them not as individuals, but as extensions of his own flesh. He believed that the Borgia blood was a magical substance, superior to all others. He wanted to be involved in every intimate detail of their lives. He hovered over them. He controlled their finances, their movements, and their marriages. But his obsession was most potent and most visible when it came to his daughter, Lucrezia. Lucrezia was the jewel of the family. She was beautiful with long golden hair that she washed in lemon juice and dried in the sunlight to keep bright. She was intelligent, graceful, and soft-spoken. To Rodrigo, she was perfect, too perfect. The ambassadors at the Vatican began to send coded letters back to their kings. They described scenes that made them uncomfortable. They wrote of a father who kissed his daughter too often, held her too long, and looked at her with an adoration that seemed to cross the invisible line of propriety. He would have her sit at his feet during official meetings with foreign dignitaries, stroking her hair while he discussed wars and treaties. It was a claustrophobic love. When he arranged her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza, it wasn't because he wanted her to be happy. It was because he needed a political alliance with the Sforza family. But even then, he couldn't bear to let her go. He demanded that the couple stay in Rome. He gave them an apartment next to his own. He was a father who could not understand the concept of boundaries. This intense isolationist arrogance created a hothouse effect within the Vatican. The Borgias were surrounded by enemies. The Roman barons hated them. The foreign powers plotted against them. The people of Rome mocked them. This hostility forced the family to turn inward. They trusted no one but each other. They spoke in their own dialect of Valencian Spanish that no one else understood. They became a cult of 4 or 5 people, believing that they were gods among insects. In this sealed environment, where the Pope was the law and morality was whatever he said it was, the normal rules of human behavior began to dissolve. If the Pope says it is not a sin, then it is not a sin. If the Pope says murder is necessary, then it is righteous. And if the Pope loves his children with a passion that mimics romantic love, who is to tell him it is wrong? Rodrigo Borgia was the architect of this nightmare. He was the one who taught his children that they were above the law. He taught Cesare that power was the only truth. He taught Lucrezia that her body was a tool to be used for the family's glory. He stripped them of their conscience before they even reached adulthood. He wasn't just a bad pope, he was a cult leader, and his followers were his own children. As we look at the portrait of Alexander VI today, we see a man in heavy jeweled robes, raising his hand in blessing. But if you look closely at the eyes, you don't see Christ. You see a predator. You see a man who looked at the 10 Commandments and treated them as a checklist of things to break. He had bought the papacy. He had moved his teenage lover into the palace. He had turned his children into princes. He had won. But in doing so, he had planted a seed of rot in the heart of Rome. And that seed was about to sprout into something terrifying. Because while Rodrigo was the architect of this nightmare, he wasn't the monster. He thought he could control the forces he was unleashing. He thought he could use Cesare's ambition and then bottle it up. He was wrong. While Rodrigo was a man of appetites, he wanted to eat, drink, and copulate. His son Cesare was different. Cesare was cold. Cesare didn't want pleasure. He wanted dominion. The monster was growing up in the room next door. And unlike his father, who killed for political gain, Cesare was beginning to discover that he simply liked the taste of blood. The stage was set. The Vatican was no longer a church. It was a stage for the most grotesque family drama in history. And the curtain was just going up. If Alexander was the appetite of the Borgia family, a man consumed by a burning, insatiable hunger for life. Then his son Cesare was the silence that follows the scream. He was the cold shadow cast by his father's bright, burning sun. While the Pope was loud, jovial, and prone to fits of laughter that echoed through the Vatican halls, Cesare was quiet. He moved through the apostolic palace like smoke. You often didn't know he was in the room until he was standing right behind you, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. Born in 1475, Cesare was groomed from birth for the church. It was the standard practice of the time. The eldest son gets the army, the second son gets the priesthood. But nature had played a cruel trick on the Borgias. Juan, the eldest, was weak, arrogant, and militarily incompetent. Cesare, the second son, was a natural-born predator. He was physically imposing, possessing a strength that was legendary in Rome. It was said he could bend a horseshoe with his bare hands and sever the head of a bull with a single stroke of a sword. He was brilliant, speaking 5 languages fluently, and possessed a mind that worked like a steel trap. He was a warrior trapped in the robes of a priest, and he hated it. When his father became pope, Cesare was made a cardinal at the age of 18. Imagine the psychological warping of a young man bursting with testosterone and violent ambition, forced to wear heavy red silk, chant litanies, and sit in endless dusty meetings about canon law. He felt suffocated. He looked at his brother Juan, who was strutting around Rome in shining armor as the captain general of the papal forces, and a deep festering resentment began to boil in Cesare's gut. He didn't want to save souls. He wanted to conquer cities. But there was something else growing inside Cesare, something darker than mere jealousy. In his early 20s, just as he was becoming the most feared man in Italy, his body began to revolt against him. He contracted the French disease. We know it today as syphilis, but in the late 15th century it was a new and terrifying plague that had swept into Italy with the invading French armies. It wasn't the mild infection that modern medicine can cure with a pill. It was a ferocious, disfiguring monster. The disease ravaged him. It started with a fever that felt like his blood was boiling. Then came the pains in the joints and bones, a constant gnawing agony that made sleep impossible. But the worst part was what it did to his face. The handsome, arrogant youth who had charmed the ladies of the court began to rot. Great pustules and sores erupted on his skin, particularly on his face and torso. They would weep and bleed, leaving behind crater-like scars. To treat it, the doctors of the time used the only thing they knew, mercury. They would slather him in toxic ointments and put him in steam boxes, effectively poisoning him to kill the disease. The side effects of the mercury were almost as bad as the syphilis itself. His teeth loosened, his hair thinned, and his mind was subjected to hallucinations and erratic mood swings. This physical deterioration changed him. It stripped away whatever humanity he had left. To hide the ruin of his face, Cesare began to wear a mask. It became his signature, a half mask of black velvet covering the upper part of his face, leaving only his thin, cruel mouth and his jaw visible. The image was terrifying. The son of the Pope, the prince of the church, walking the corridors of the Vatican in a black mask. It terrified people. You couldn't see his eyes. You couldn't read his expression. You could only see the darkness where a face should be. He became a faceless entity of power. When he spoke, his voice was muffled slightly by the velvet, making him sound even more detached, more inhuman. This mask allowed him to become the Prince of Shadows. He began to live by night. While Rome slept, Cesare Borgia was awake. He would roam the streets with his personal guard, a pack of thugs and assassins who answered only to him. They weren't patrolling to keep the peace, they were hunting. Sometimes they hunted political enemies, Sometimes they hunted women, and sometimes it was whispered. They hunted simply for the sport of it. If Rodrigo Borgia represented the corruption of the institution, Cesare represented the corruption of the soul. He was the first modern tyrant. He didn't care about God. He didn't care about tradition. He realized long before Machiavelli wrote it down that power is not given. It is taken, and it is taken by the man who is willing to do what others are not. He instituted a reign of terror that was psychological as much as it was physical. He had a network of spies that covered the city like a spider web. No one felt safe. A cardinal could whisper a joke about the Borgias in the privacy of his own bedroom, and the next morning he would find Cesare staring at him across the altar during Mass. That black mask turned in his direction, silent and knowing. But the most disturbing aspect of Cesare's psychology was not his violence. It was his love, or rather, his possession. The Borgia family was an island. They felt they were a superior species, distinct from the rest of humanity. And within this island, the connection between Cesare and his sister Lucrezia was a source of endless, horrified fascination for the people of Rome. Cesare didn't look at Lucrezia like a brother looks at a sister. He looked at her like a miser looks at his gold. He was obsessively protective of her. When she was married to Giovanni Sforza and later Alfonso of Aragon, Cesare was always there, lurking in the background. He treated her husbands not as family members, but as interlopers. They were thieves who had stolen something that belonged to him. This was the core of the forbidden sect mentality. To Cesare, the only people who mattered were Borgias. Everyone else was expendable. Everyone else was prey. And Lucrezia was the heart of the family. He wanted to control who she spoke to, who she smiled at, and who she slept with. There is a chilling anecdote from this period that illustrates his mindset. During a festival in Rome, Cesare participated in a bullfight. He rode into the arena on a magnificent charger, dressed in black and gold. He didn't salute the crowd. He rode directly to the box where Lucrezia was sitting. He bowed only to her. Then he turned and killed 6 bulls in a row, severing the head of the last one with a single stroke, all while looking up at her balcony. It was a display of virility and violence, performed for an audience of one. The tension in the Vatican was becoming unbearable. You had a father who loved his children too much, and a son who loved his sister too much, and a brother, Juan, who was caught in the middle. Juan Borgia, the Duke of Gandia, was everything Cesare was not. He was the favorite son of the Pope, spoiled, petulant, and flashy. He wore diamonds on his boots. He boasted of his sexual conquests, and he held the position that Cesare coveted, Captain General of the Church. Juan commanded the armies that Cesare was born to lead. Cesare watched Juan with the cold, dead eyes behind his mask. He watched his father dote on this incompetent fool. He watched Juan parade around Rome, bringing shame to the family name with his military failures and his drunken behavior. And worse, he watched Juan interact with Lucrezia. The jealousy was a physical weight in the air. It wasn't just sibling rivalry. It was a primal struggle for dominance in the pack. Cesare knew that as long as Juan was alive, he would never be the true power in Rome. He would always be the cardinal, the priest in a mask, relegated to the shadows, while his idiot brother bathed in the light. And Cesare Borgia did not belong in the shadows. He was the shadow. By the summer of 1497, the atmosphere in the Vatican was heavy with impending doom. It was like the air before a thunderstorm, static, thick, and difficult to breathe. The servants walked on tiptoe. The courtiers spoke in hushed tones. Everyone could see the way Cesare looked at Juan. It was the look of a wolf watching a fatted calf that had strayed too far from the safety of the herd. The Prince of Darkness was done waiting. He was done praying. He had decided that if God wouldn't give him what he wanted, he would take it. And he would take it with a knife. The family that believed their blood was sacred was about to spill it in the gutters of Rome. The first great tragedy of the House of Borgia was merely hours away, and it would begin with a dinner that was supposed to be a celebration of brotherhood, but would end as a requiem. If Alexander was the appetite and Cesare was the violence, then Lucrezia Borgia was the victim. But in the twisted, inverted logic of the House of Borgia, even the victim is dangerous. For 500 years, history has painted Lucrezia as a monster. She has been caricatured as the Black Widow of the Vatican, a creature of depravity who kept a hollow ring filled with arsenic on her finger, slipping death into the wine of her lovers with a kiss. We are told she was a sorceress, a siren who lured men to their doom to feed the ambitions of her family. But if you strip away the centuries of slander and look at the contemporary records, you find something far more disturbing than a villain. You find a hostage. Lucrezia was beautiful, not in the dark, brooding way of her brother Cesare, but in a radiant, almost angelic way that seemed to defy the gloom of the Vatican. She had heavy strawberry blonde hair that fell to her knees, hair she washed in a special mixture of lemon juice and wood ash, drying it for hours in the fierce Roman sun to bleach it to the color of spun gold. She had hazel eyes that changed color with her mood, and a grace that captivated every poet and ambassador who met her. She was soft-spoken, intelligent, and by all accounts genuinely pious. She was the perfect Renaissance princess, but in the eyes of her father and brother, she wasn't a person. She was currency. To Pope Alexander VI, she was a political coin to be spent. He married her off when she was barely 13 to Giovanni Sforza, a powerful lord, to secure a military alliance. When that alliance became useless, he forced her to divorce him. When she was 18, he married her to Alfonso of Aragon to secure Naples. When Alfonso became a liability, her brother Cesare had him butchered. Then she was married again to the Duke of Ferrara. She was passed from hand to hand like a deed to a property, used to buy armies and silence enemies. But the tragedy of Lucrezia wasn't just that she was used. It was that she was loved. And in the Borgia family, love was a suffocating, toxic thing that destroyed everything it touched. We have spoken of the Borgia sickness, this insular, narcissistic belief that their blood was divine. This sickness manifested most clearly in the way the men of the family looked at Lucrezia. They were obsessed with her. Her father, the Pope, doted on her with a physical intensity that made the Vatican court hold its breath. He gave her the keys to his private apartments. He trusted her more than any cardinal. When he traveled, he left her in charge of the Vatican. Imagine the scandal of a teenage girl sitting in the chair of St. Peter, opening the Pope's mail, managing the financial affairs of the church. It was unheard of. It was blasphemous. But it was his physical affection that sparked the whispers. Ambassadors sent coded dispatches home describing how the Pope would kiss her too often, embrace her too tightly, and have her sit at his feet during official consistories, stroking her hair while he discussed matters of state. It was a love that lacked boundaries. It was a love that felt proprietary. Then there was Cesare. If the Pope loved her with a suffocating heat, Cesare loved her with a cold, sharp jealousy. Cesare saw Lucrezia as his female mirror image. They were two halves of the same soul. He was the dark. She was the light. He guarded her with the ferocity of a lover, not a brother. He viewed her husbands not as family, but as trespassers who were stealing something that belonged to him. And this brings us to the darkest stain on the Borgia name, the word that followed them like a shadow, eventually written into history by their enemies: incest. The rumors began as whispers in the dark corners of Rome. They said that the Pope loved his daughter in ways a father should not. They said that Cesare shared his sister's bed. At first, these were just insults thrown by their enemies. But then, in 1497, the Borgias did something that turned these whispers into a scream. They created a paper trail. The scandal centers around a mysterious child. His name was Giovanni Borgia, but history knows him by a far stranger, more ominous title: the Infans Romanus, the Child of Rome. The year was 1497. Lucrezia was in a state of limbo. Her father was in the process of annulling her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza. To justify the annulment, the Pope claimed that Sforza was impotent, that he had never consummated the marriage. It was a public humiliation for Sforza. Enraged and cornered, Sforza lashed out. He signed the annulment papers to save his life, but he left Rome with a parting shot that would burn down the Borgia reputation. He publicly declared, "The Pope only wants to annul my marriage so that he can have his daughter all to himself." It was a nuclear accusation. But while this war of words was happening, Lucrezia disappeared. She was sequestered in the convent of San Sisto. The official story was that she was there for religious reflection, to separate herself from the world while the legal proceedings took place. But the whispers in Rome said she was there to hide a pregnancy. During those months in the convent, there were rumors of a lover, a young Spaniard named Pedro Calderon, known as Perotto, who served as a messenger between the Pope and his daughter. Perotto was young, handsome, and foolish. Months later, Perotto's body was fished out of the Tiber River. He was found with his hands tied behind his back and a stone around his neck. And shortly after his death, a baby boy appeared in the Borgia household. Who was this child? The Vatican tried to obscure the truth to protect Lucrezia's reputation, so she could be married off again as a maiden of intact virtue. But in doing so, they created a legal nightmare that stands as the smoking gun of their depravity. To ensure this child, Giovanni, would be wealthy and protected, the Borgias needed to legitimize him. They issued 2 official papal bulls, decrees signed by the Pope himself. They are dated to the same period, but they tell 2 completely different and equally horrifying stories. The first bull, which was made public, declared that the child, Giovanni, was the illegitimate son of Cesare Borgia and an unwed woman. This was scandalous, a cardinal fathering a bastard, but it was manageable. It kept the child in the family. But then historians found the second bull. This one was kept secret in the Vatican archives for centuries. It corrected the first one. It stated that the child, Giovanni, was not the son of Cesare. It declared that he was the son of Pope Alexander VI himself and an unwed woman. The implications of that document were monstrous. The Pope claimed paternity of a child who appeared exactly when his daughter Lucrezia was rumored to be pregnant. There were only 2 possibilities, and both were monstrous. Possibility 1. The child was Lucrezia's, fathered by the murdered messenger Perotto. If this was true, the Pope and Cesare claimed the baby as their own to cover up Lucrezia's shame, creating a bizarre, twisted lie where the grandfather claims to be the father to hide the daughter's indiscretion. Possibility 2. The rumors were true. The child was the product of incest. If the Pope was the father and Lucrezia was the mother, then Alexander VI had fathered a child with his own daughter. If Cesare was the father, he had fathered a child with his own sister. The public didn't need proof. They looked at the timing. They looked at the murder of Perotto. They looked at the secrecy. and they looked at the way the Pope played with this mysterious child, Giovanni. He brought the boy into the Vatican, lavished him with titles like the Duke of Camerino, and treated him with the same obsessive, doting affection he showed Lucrezia. The infans Romanus became a living symbol of the Borgia rot. He was a child with no clear mother, claimed by two different fathers who were father and son to each other. He was a biological riddle wrapped in velvet. For Lucrezia, this was a psychological torture chamber. Imagine the mental state of a young woman living in a palace where your father and brother fight over ownership of your soul, your body, and your secrets. She was trapped in a hothouse of affection that felt more like a prison. This is where the concept of the poisoned pawn becomes clear. Lucrezia was not the poisoner. She was the one being poisoned. She was being poisoned by the atmosphere of her own home. She was taught that the outside world was evil, that her husbands were temporary, and that the only safety was within the arms of her blood relatives. This is a classic cult tactic: isolation and dependency. Alexander and Cesare convinced her that no husband would ever love her as much as they did. They gaslighted her into believing that their twisted, suffocating control was the highest form of devotion. And the tragedy is, she loved them back. She was fiercely loyal to the monsters who were destroying her reputation. When Cesare committed atrocities, she wept, but she stayed. When her father used her as a bribe, she complained, but she obeyed. She was a victim of Stockholm Syndrome long before the term existed, but the pressure inside the Vatican was building to a breaking point. The existence of the infans Romanus, the annulment of her first marriage, the rumors of incest, it was all creating a toxic cloud that hung over Rome. The people began to see the Borgias not just as corrupt rulers, but as demons. They whispered that the Pope had made a pact with the devil and that the price was the purity of his own bloodline. Biting satire began to appear on the statues of Rome. Poems were nailed to church doors calling Lucrezia Thais, a famous prostitute of antiquity, and calling the Pope a beast who plowed his own field. The psychological wall around the family was beginning to crack, and in the shadows, Cesare Borgia was watching. He saw the way the world looked at his sister. He saw the insults painted on the walls of the city. He felt the humiliation burning his skin beneath his black velvet mask, and his rage began to curdle into something lethal. He didn't blame himself. He didn't blame his father. He blamed the weakness of others, and specifically, he began to turn his cold, dead eyes toward his brother, Juan. Juan Borgia, the Duke of Gandia, was the only one in the family who didn't seem to understand the danger they were in. While Lucrezia suffered under the weight of the scandal and Cesare plotted in the dark, Juan was acting the fool. He was partying in the streets. He was sleeping with the wives of Roman barons. He was insulting powerful enemies. He was a loose cannon on a sinking ship. And worse, Juan had begun to mock Cesare. He taunted him about his disfigured face. He taunted him about his role as a priest, and it is whispered he made a fatal error. He made a joke about Lucrezia. He made a joke about the closeness between Cesare and their sister. That was the mistake. In the House of Borgia, you can buy the papacy. You can sleep with the wives of kings. You can even claim a bastard child as a prince of Rome. But you do not touch the bond between Cesare and Lucrezia. The stage was set for the next act of this tragedy. The sickness had been established. The taboo had been confirmed by ink and paper. Now it was time for the blood. The tension that had been building between the brothers, the Prince of Light and the Prince of Darkness, was about to snap. And when a Borgia snaps, people don't just get hurt, they disappear. Rome went to sleep on the night of June 14th, 1497, unaware that by morning the Pope would be screaming in agony. The rivalry between the brothers, the Prince of Light and the Prince of Darkness, had finally reached its breaking point. Juan, blinded by his status as the Pope's favorite, had pushed his brother too far. He flaunted his titles and treated Cesare not as a threat, but as a priest to be mocked. He didn't realize that he was taunting a cobra. On that evening, their mother, Vanosa de Catane, decided to intervene. She invited her children to a vineyard she owned near the Vatican for a family dinner. It was meant to be a reconciliation, a last supper of sorts. Cesare, Juan, and their cousin were there. They ate, they drank the heavy red wine of the Roman hills, and they pretended to be a loving family. Cesare was charming that night. Witnesses described him as unusually polite, his black velvet mask hiding whatever expression lay beneath. Juan was his usual boisterous self, draped in expensive jewelry, laughing too loud, drinking too much. He felt safe. He was the Pope's son, the most protected man in Rome. As midnight approached, the brothers mounted their mules to return to the Vatican. They rode together for a while, the hooves clattering on the cobblestones. But as they reached the bridge near the Jewish quarter, Juan pulled on his reins. He told Cesare he wasn't going back to the palace yet. He said he had business to attend to. He hinted at a rendezvous with a lady. Cesare nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't warn him about the dangers of Rome at night. He simply watched his brother ride away into the darkness. Juan was not alone. Witnesses saw a mysterious figure join him, a man wearing a mask riding on the back of Juan's mule. Who was this man? A servant, a pimp, or an assassin leading the lamb to the slaughter? Juan Borgia rode into the dark alleys of Rome and vanished from the face of the earth. The next morning the sun rose over the Vatican, but the Duke of Gandia did not return. At first the Pope wasn't worried. He knew his son's habits. He assumed Juan was sleeping off a hangover in the bed of a prostitute. "He will come back when he is hungry," Alexander joked. But a day passed, then a night, then another morning. The Pope's joking stopped. A cold panic began to grip the apostolic palace. The silence from Juan's quarters was deafening. Alexander VI ordered a frantic search. The city watch turned Rome upside down. They questioned innkeepers, prostitutes, and thieves. Finally, they found a witness, a man named Giorgio Schiavoni, a timber merchant who lived on a boat moored on the Tiber River. He was a rough man, used to the brutal realities of Roman life. When the papal guards dragged him in for questioning, he gave a testimony that was chilling in its nonchalance. "Did you see anything on the night of the 14th? The guards asked. Giorgio shrugged. "I saw two men come to the riverbank," he said. They looked around to see if anyone was watching. Then two other men came out of the shadows dragging a body. They swung it once, twice, and threw it into the water. The guards were horrified. "Why didn't you report it?" they screamed. Giorgio looked at them with tired, cynical eyes. "In my time on this river," he said, "I have seen 100 bodies thrown into the water on 100 different nights. No one ever cared before. Why should I bother now?" That sentence encapsulates the horror of Borgia Rome. Murder was so common it was essentially a method of garbage disposal. Based on Giorgio's directions, the fishermen began to dredge the river. They used hooks and nets, dragging the muddy bottom of the Tiber. The Pope waited in his apartments, pacing, weeping, praying to a god he had largely ignored. At midday, the hooks caught something heavy. Slowly, heavily, a body was pulled from the silt and sludge. It was bloated with water, covered in mud, but the flash of gold was unmistakable. It was Juan Borgia. He was still wearing his velvet doublet, his high leather boots, and his gloves. And here is the detail that confirmed the darkest suspicions. His purse was still on his belt. Inside were 30 gold ducats. A small fortune. This was not a robbery. A bandit would have taken the gold. A bandit would have stripped the expensive clothes. This was an execution. They laid the body on the riverbank and washed away the mud. The autopsy revealed the fury of the killer. Juan had been stabbed 9 times. There were wounds in his chest, his legs, and his hands, suggesting he had fought for his life, but the fatal blow was a deep, savage slash across his throat that had nearly decapitated him. When the news reached the Vatican, Pope Alexander VI collapsed. The transformation in him was terrifying. The jovial, confident man disintegrated. He locked himself in his room and howled. Not cried, howled. His screams were so loud and so primal that they could be heard in the streets outside the Vatican walls. He refused to eat or drink for days. He beat his head against the wall. It was the grief of an animal that had lost its cub. But while the father wept, the brother watched. Cesare Borgia's reaction to Juan's death was the subject of intense scrutiny. He did not weep. He did not scream. He was unnervingly calm. During the funeral procession, as Juan's body was carried through the streets to the church of Santa Maria del Popolo, Cesare walked behind the coffin with a face like stone. The investigation into the murder was launched with fury. The Pope swore he would find the killer, even if it was the King of France himself. But then abruptly, the investigation stopped. Why? Rumors began to circulate that the evidence was pointing too close to home. The City Watch had found traces, whispers, and motives that led back to the Vatican itself. They led back to the man in the black mask. Cesare had the motive. He wanted Juan's title. He wanted Juan's power, and he wanted Sancha. He had the means, his personal guard of assassins, and he had the opportunity. He was the last person to see Juan alive before he rode into the dark. The realization hit Pope Alexander VI like a physical blow. The investigation was quietly shelved. No one was ever charged. The Pope stopped talking about justice. He realized that to avenge one son, he would have to execute the other. The death of Juan Borgia was the turning point for the family. It was the moment the sickness turned terminal. The golden pillar had fallen, and in its place the dark pillar, Cesare, rose to fill the void. Within weeks of Juan's death, Cesare did the unthinkable. He walked into the consistory of cardinals and demanded to be released from his holy vows. He resigned his cardinalship. He traded his red hat for a helmet. He took command of the papal armies, the very position his brother had died holding. He stepped over his brother's wet, muddy corpse to grab the sword he had always wanted. The Tiber River flowed on, keeping its secrets. But the people of Rome knew. They looked at Cesare Borgia, riding at the head of the army, his face hidden, his sword sharp, and they knew they were looking at a fratricide. The Prince of Shadows had emerged from the darkness, and he was covered in his own family's blood. But the violence was just beginning. If Juan's death was a tragedy of passion, the next chapter would be a tragedy of cold, calculated humiliation. The Borgias were done killing their own. Now, it was time to destroy the outsiders who had dared to marry into their cursed bloodline. The waters of the Tiber River had barely settled over the corpse of Juan Borgia when the relentless machinery of the family began to turn once again, proving that in the Vatican, grief was merely a temporary state while ambition was permanent. With his brother dead and the path to power finally cleared, Cesare Borgia wasted no time in shedding the skin of the priest he had always hated. In a ceremony that shocked the conservative cardinals, he walked into the consistory, stripped off his red robes, and laid them on the altar, effectively resigning his cardinalship to strap on a sword. The Prince of Shadows was now the captain general of the papal armies, ready to carve out a kingdom in the Romagna. However, to conquer Italy, the Borgias needed fresh alliances, And to secure those alliances, they needed to liquidate their most valuable asset and resell it to the highest bidder. That asset was Lucrezia. The problem facing Pope Alexander VI was that his daughter was already spent currency, having been married for 4 years to Giovanni Sforza, the Lord of Pesaro. When the marriage was originally arranged in 1493, the Sforza family of Milan was a crucial military ally that kept the Borgias safe, but the shifting tides of Italian politics had turned the Sforzas into liabilities. Giovanni was no longer useful. He was merely a piece of political debris cluttering up the Vatican apartments, a man who stood in the way of a more lucrative match with the Kingdom of Naples. In any other noble family, a political shift might result in a quiet separation or a life lived in separate palaces. But the Borgias did not do things by half measures. They did not simply want to end the marriage. They wanted to erase it entirely from history, as if it had never happened. Cesare, with his characteristic disregard for human life, offered the simplest solution. He would have Giovanni Sforza killed, perhaps a knife in the dark, or a poisoned cup of wine, simple and clean. But Pope Alexander VI, perhaps weary of the stench of death after the murder of his favorite son Juan, chose a different path, one that was less bloody but infinitely more cruel. He decided to destroy Giovanni Sforza not physically, but biologically, by stripping him of his manhood in front of the entire courts of Europe. The Vatican lawyers, guided by the Pope's ruthless pragmatism, drafted a legal document that made the entirety of Rome gasp in disbelief. They filed for an annulment on the grounds of non-consummation, claiming that in 4 years of marriage, sleeping in the same bed, Giovanni Sforza had never once known his wife biblically. They branded him with the Latin term maleficia, implying a bewitchment or a physical defect, but the street term was far more brutal. They called him impotent. In the hyper-masculine, honor-obsessed culture of the Italian Renaissance, this accusation was a fate worse than death because a man's authority, his right to rule his subjects, and his very identity were inextricably tied to his virility. To be called impotent by the vicar of Christ himself was to be socially castrated, turning Giovanni into a laughingstock from Naples to Milan. Giovanni was apoplectic with rage when the papers were presented to him, knowing full well that it was a lie and that he had consummated the marriage countless times. He fought back with a desperate fury, refusing to sign the annulment papers and publicly claiming that he had slept with Lucrezia 1,000 times. But he was fighting a losing battle against a family that controlled the very definition of truth. To break his will, the Borgias escalated the situation by introducing a weapon of psychological terror that demonstrates just how depraved the atmosphere in the Vatican had become. They threatened Giovanni with the Congresso, a medieval legal procedure used in disputed cases of impotence that bordered on legalized pornography. The threat was explicit. If Giovanni refused to admit his inadequacy, he would be forced to prove his potency in a courtroom setting. He would have to perform the sexual act with his wife in front of a panel of court-appointed witnesses, doctors, lawyers, and matrons, who would watch, take notes, and judge his performance to see if he could achieve an erection and insemination. The sheer sickness of this threat cannot be overstated. The Pope was effectively threatening to force his son-in-law to have sex with his daughter in front of an audience of old men, solely to prove a political point and clear the ledger for a new transaction. Lucrezia, who is often portrayed as a villain, showed a rare spark of humanity and resistance in this sordid affair. Realizing that her family was backing her husband into a corner from which there was no escape, she secretly met with Giovanni or sent a trusted messenger to deliver a chilling warning. She told him that the legal battle was merely a formality, and that if he did not leave Rome immediately, Cesare would tire of the lawyers and send the assassins. The message was clear. My brother does not make threats, he makes promises. Terrified by the shadow of Cesare's knife and humiliated by the relentlessness of the Pope's legal team, Giovanni Sforza broke. He fled Rome in the dead of night on a Turkish horse, riding with such desperate speed toward his home in Pesaro that the animal reportedly collapsed and died of exhaustion the moment he arrived at his castle gates. Broken, cornered, and fearing for his life, Giovanni Sforza finally capitulated. He signed the papers confessing that he was impotent and that he had never touched his wife. He signed a declaration that Lucrezia Borgia was untouched, a virgin intact, despite being a married woman of 20 who had likely been pregnant. It was a grotesque lie, a legal fiction that allowed Pope Alexander VI to market his daughter to the next royal suitor as brand new goods, untouched and pure. But Giovanni Sforza had one weapon left, a weapon made not of steel, but of words. And as he signed away his honor, he decided to burn the House of Borgia to the ground with a single sentence. He realized that the Borgias' motivation went beyond simple politics. There was a possessiveness in the way the Pope and Cesare guarded Lucrezia that was unnatural. Speaking to the ambassador of Milan, Giovanni Sforza spat out the accusation that would define the family forever. The Pope wants to annul my marriage, not because I am impotent, but because he wants to have the freedom to enjoy his daughter himself. It was a nuclear explosion of scandal. Before this moment, the rumors of incest were merely whispers in the taverns or jokes among the Roman soldiers. Now, a duke who had lived inside the Vatican walls, a member of the family by marriage, had gone on official diplomatic record accusing the Pope of sleeping with his own daughter. The accusation spread like wildfire across Europe, written into dispatches and mocked in plays, branding the Borgias not just as corrupt tyrants, but as sexual monsters who violated the most sacred taboos of humanity. While Giovanni Sforza was being destroyed in the north, another tragedy of humiliation was playing out inside the Vatican walls, involving the youngest brother, Geoffrey Borgia. Geoffrey was the afterthought of the family, a weak, quiet boy of 16 who had been married to Sancha of Aragon to secure peace with Naples. But Sancha was a woman of voracious appetites who had no patience for a child husband, and she turned her eyes toward the more powerful men in the family. It was an open secret that Sancha was sleeping with both Juan, before his death, and Cesare, creating a dynamic of utter depravity where the brothers shared the wife of their younger sibling. Geoffrey was forced to live as a cuckold in his own home, enduring the knowing smirks of the courtiers and watching his wife flirt openly with his brother at the dinner table. This reinforced the image of the Borgias as a family without boundaries, where every relationship was fluid and incestuous, and where the weak were cannibalized by the strong. With Giovanni Sforza exiled and disgraced, and Lucrezia legally declared a virgin once more, the board was cleared for the next move. The Borgias immediately arranged a new marriage for her, this time with Alfonso of Aragon, the Duke of Bisceglie. Alfonso was everything Giovanni was not. He was 17, incredibly handsome, gentle, and by all accounts a good man. When Lucrezia saw him, something unexpected and dangerous happened. She fell in love. For the first time in her tragic, manipulated life, she experienced a genuine connection, a sweet, normal love that had nothing to do with the suffocating possession of her father or the dark obsession of her brother. They married, and for a brief, shining moment, the Vatican apartments were filled with the laughter of a happy couple, and it seemed possible that Lucrezia might escape the curse of her bloodline. However, happiness was a forbidden commodity in the House of Borgia. Cesare watched this new marriage from the shadows with a cold reptilian detachment that slowly morphed into rage. He saw his sister smiling at another man. He saw her glowing with a happiness that he had not provided. And he saw Alfonso not as a brother-in-law, but as another trespasser stealing his property. The jealousy that had led to Juan's murder began to stir again, darker and more intense than before. Alfonso of Aragon, blinded by his love for Lucrezia, did not realize he was walking into a trap. He thought he was marrying into a powerful dynasty, unaware that he was stepping into a spider's web where the spider wore a mask and carried a very sharp knife. The humiliation of Giovanni Sforza had been a tragedy of ink and paper, a destruction of reputation. But the tragedy of Alfonso of Aragon would be written entirely in blood, marking the descent of the Borgias from political manipulators to butchers. By the turning of the century, as the year 1500 approached, the transformation of Cesare Borgia was absolute. The young man who had once knelt at the altar in the red silk of a cardinal had vanished entirely, replaced by a figure of steel and leather who now stood at the right hand of the Pope as the captain general of the papal armies. He had successfully petitioned the College of Cardinals to release him from his holy vows, the first man in the history of the Catholic Church to resign the cardinalate, and in doing so, he had shed the pretense of piety to embrace his true nature as a creature of war. However, to build a dynasty that would outlast the fragile life of his aging father, Cesare realized that he required more than just the thundering cannons of an army on the battlefield. He required a mechanism of absolute terror that could operate in the silence of the shadows, a way to extinguish dissent before it could even be whispered in the taverns of Rome. He needed an instrument that was devoid of conscience, a tool that could reach into the locked bedrooms of his enemies and snuff out their lives without leaving a trace. He found that instrument in a man whose very name would become a byword for the cold, mechanical efficiency of death, Micheletto Corella. If Cesare Borgia was the corrupted, feverish brain of this new regime, devising complex geopolitical stratagems and harboring dark, incestuous obsessions behind his velvet mask, then Micheletto was the hand, a hand that did not tremble, did not hesitate, and did not feel. History has left us with a chillingly sparse biography of this man, often referred to in the archives simply as Don Michelotto. We know he was a Spaniard from Valencia, likely a friend of Cesare's from their student days at the University of Pisa, but beyond that, he exists as a specter. He had no known family, no wife, no children, and no personal ambition beyond serving his master. It was as if he had sprung fully formed from the darkness of Cesare's own shadow, a golem constructed solely to kill. Ostensibly, he held the rank of a captain in the papal army, but his true function was far more intimate and terrifying. He was Cesare's boia, his personal executioner, the keeper of the family's darkest secrets, and the only man in Rome who could look the Prince of Shadows in the eye without flinching. Micheletto represented a fundamental shift in the nature of violence within the Eternal City. Before the Borgias, Roman violence was hot-blooded and chaotic. Barons fighting with broadswords in the streets, vendettas settled with clumsy daggers in crowded piazzas, a messy and loud affair. Micheletto brought the precision of a surgeon to the art of murder, introducing a detached clinical professionalism that was alien to the Italian temperament. He was a virtuoso of the garrote, a method of strangulation that was favored by the Spanish Inquisition and brought to horrifying perfection in the damp dungeons of the Castel Sant'Angelo. The garrote was a weapon of terrifying intimacy and silence. It consisted of a length of strong cord or wire attached to a wooden handle or stick, which could be slipped around a victim's neck in a crowded room, a dark alley, or even during a friendly embrace. With a single, violent twist of the wrist, the windpipe was crushed, the blood supply to the brain was severed, and the victim would drop like a stone without a scream, their life extinguished in seconds with a terrifying lack of fanfare. The psychological impact of Micheletto Carella on the populace of Rome was profound and paralyzing. He became a living urban legend, a bogeyman used to frighten children and silence critics. It was whispered in the marketplaces and the brothels that if you spoke ill of Pope Alexander VI or his son, you would not be arrested by the city guard and given a trial. Instead, you would simply wake up in the middle of the night to find Micheletto standing at the foot of your bed, his face impassive, the wire already in his hands. His loyalty to Cesare was absolute and terrifyingly devoid of morality. He did not kill for ideology, for religion, or for money, but simply because Cesare willed it. They formed a dyad of death, the prince and his executioner, moving through the intricate chessboard of Italian politics and removing pieces not by strategy, but by simply sweeping them off the board and into the grave. Under Micheletto's grim supervision, the Tiber River became the unofficial graveyard of the Borgia regime, swallowing a steady stream of inconvenient people. Cardinals who refused to align their votes, bishops who held lands the Borgias coveted, noblemen who insulted the family honor, and servants who saw too much, all found their way into the murky waters under the cover of darkness. Micheletto established a reign of terror, where the silence of the city was the loudest testament to his effectiveness. People stopped writing letters for fear they would be intercepted by his spies. They stopped holding lavish dinner parties for fear that the wine would be tainted with Cantarella, and they stopped walking out at night for fear of the garrote. He was the grim reaper of the Borgia ambition, the eraser of mistakes, the final period at the end of every sentence. But the most disturbing aspect of Micheletto's role was his proximity to the domestic, private life of the family. He was not a soldier kept in the barracks. He lived in the Vatican, moved freely through the private apartments, and was privy to the most intimate and scandalous moments of the Borgia clan. He was a fixture in the background of family dinners, a silent observer of the incestuous tension that vibrated between Cesare and Lucrezia, and a witness to the hothouse madness that consumed them, because he knew where all the bodies were buried literally and metaphorically. He became untouchable, a man who held the keys to the Borgia closet of skeletons. He saw the Pope in his moments of gluttony. He saw Cesare in his moments of syphilitic agony, and he saw Lucrezia in her moments of despair. He was the repository of their sins, a walking confessional booth that never granted absolution, only silence. As the Jubilee year of 1500 began bringing thousands of pilgrims to Rome to seek forgiveness for their sins, the shadow of Micheletto began to lengthen specifically over the happiness of Lucrezia Borgia. She was currently married to Alfonso of Aragon, the Duke of Bisceglie, the handsome young Neapolitan prince she genuinely loved. They had a child together, and for a brief shining moment it seemed that Lucrezia had managed to carve out a sanctuary of normalcy within the asylum of her family. But Cesare's jealousy, that cold reptilian possession that had already claimed the life of his brother Juan, was beginning to fixate on Alfonso with a renewed and deadly intensity. Cesare despised Alfonso, not just because he represented a political alliance with Naples that was no longer useful, but because he was beautiful, he was innocent, and he was loved by Lucrezia in a pure way that Cesare with his rotting face and darkened soul, could never be. Cesare hated the sight of their domestic bliss. He hated the way Lucrezia smiled at her husband. He hated the fact that there was a part of his sister's heart that he did not own. To Cesare, Alfonso was not a brother-in-law. He was a parasite attached to the host, a thief who had stolen the affection that belonged to the Borgia bloodline. And when Cesare hated, Micheletto acted. The silent assassin began to shadow the young duke, watching him from the colonnades of St. Peter's, tracking his movements through the city, and studying his habits with the cold calculation of a butcher sizing up a prize lamb. The atmosphere in the Vatican shifted perceptibly from the celebratory mood of a young marriage to the tense, suffocating anticipation of a hunt. Alfonso, though young and naive, began to feel the eyes on him. He noticed the man in black who was always a few paces behind him when he walked in the Vatican gardens. He noticed the silence that fell when he entered a room, and he noticed the way Cesare looked at him across the dinner table, a look of predatory boredom. Alfonso did not yet realize that he had ceased to be a person in the eyes of his in-laws. He had become an obstacle, a weed in the Borgia garden that needed to be pulled out by the root. He was living in a palace where the walls had ears, the wine had poison, and the shadows had knives. The Jubilee year of 1500 was meant to be a time of universal forgiveness, a holy year where pilgrims from all over Christendom flocked to Rome to cleanse their souls. But within the walls of the Vatican, there was no forgiveness to be found, only a festering, malignant hatred that was about to boil over into one of the most grotesque crimes in history. The target of this hatred was Alfonso of Aragon, the Duke of Bisceglie, the 18-year-old husband of Lucrezia Borgia. He was a young man guilty of nothing but being loved by the wrong woman and standing in the way of the wrong man. Cesare Borgia had decided that Alfonso was no longer a useful political pawn. Worse, he was an emotional rival who occupied the heart of his sister. And in the logic of the Borgia family, when a pawn becomes an obstacle, it is swept off the board. The first attempt to erase Alfonso took place on the sweltering night of July 15th, 1500. It was a scene that could have been ripped from a Shakespearean tragedy. Alfonso was leaving the Vatican after a late dinner with his wife and father-in-law. As he walked down the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, surrounded by the shadows of the holy columns, the darkness suddenly came alive. A pack of hired assassins leaped from the gloom, their daggers drawn. They did not demand money, they went straight for the kill. They fell upon the young prince with a frenzy, stabbing him repeatedly in the head, the shoulders, and the legs. But Alfonso was young and desperate to live. He fought back with a surprising ferocity, and his screams alerted the papal guards. The assassins, realizing they had lost the element of surprise, fled into the night, leaving Alfonso bleeding out on the cold stone steps of the church. He was not dead, but he was mangled. In a cruel twist of irony, the guards picked up his broken body and carried him not to a hospital, but back into the Vatican, back into the very lair of the beast that had tried to devour him. He was carried to the Borgia apartments, leaving a trail of bright red blood across the marble floors of the apostolic palace. When Lucrezia saw her husband, this beautiful young man she adored, now a ruin of slashed flesh and bone, she fainted dead away. But when she awoke, a steely resolve took over. She realized instantly what had happened. This was not a robbery. This was a hit, and she knew exactly who had ordered it. The horror of her situation is almost impossible to imagine. She had to nurse her husband back to health inside the house of the man who wanted him dead. Her home had become a hunting ground, and the hunter was her own brother. For the next 30 days, a siege mentality descended upon the Borgia apartments. The room where Alfonso lay recovering was turned into a fortress. Lucrezia and Sancha of Aragon, Alfonso's sister, took charge. They knew that the assassins would try again, likely using a method that required less noise: poison. The two women, both princesses of royal blood, stopped acting like nobility and started acting like bodyguards. They refused to let any food from the Vatican kitchens enter the room. They set up a makeshift stove in the corner of the bedroom and began to cook Alfonso's meals themselves, tasting every spoon of broth and every cup of wine before it touched his lips. They locked the doors and stood guard in shifts, terrified that if they blinked, death would slip through the keyhole. It was a claustrophobic nightmare. The heat of the Roman August was suffocating, trapping the smell of sickness, blood, and fear inside the unventilated room. And outside the door, the predator was pacing. Cesare Borgia did not hide his disappointment that Alfonso had survived. He did not pretend to grieve. In fact, he came to visit. One afternoon, Cesare walked into the sick room. He ignored the tears of his sister and the glare of Sancha. He walked over to the bed where Alfonso lay, pale and bandaged, but slowly recovering. Cesare looked down at the broken boy with a cold, dead smile. He didn't offer prayers for recovery. Instead, he leaned in and whispered a sentence that has echoed down through 5 centuries as the ultimate expression of Borgia arrogance. He said, "Do not worry. What is not done at lunch will be finished at dinner." It was a declaration of intent. He was telling them, to their faces, that their efforts were futile. He was telling them that he was death itself, and death could not be cheated twice. Lucrezia was frantic. She wrote desperate letters to the King of Naples, begging for help, begging for an escort to get Alfonso out of Rome. But the letters were intercepted. The Vatican was a cage, and the door was bolted. Pope Alexander VI, the father who claimed to love her, did nothing. He stood by, wringing his hands, unwilling to stop his son. He was either too afraid of Cesare or too complicit in the plot. The silence of the Pope was the final nail in Alfonso's coffin. The end came on August 18, 1500. Alfonso was recovering. His wounds were closing. The color was returning to his cheeks. The care of Lucrezia and Sancha was working. But Cesare was done waiting. He decided to stop playing with his food. Micheletto Corella, the silent assassin, arrived at the door of the sick room with a squad of armed guards. He didn't knock. He burst in. The scene was chaotic. Micheletto claimed that Alfonso was plotting against the Borgias, that he had seen the injured boy firing a crossbow from the window at Cesare in the garden, a ludicrous, impossible lie given Alfonso's injuries. But truth didn't matter. Micheletto ordered the women out of the room. Lucrezia threw herself between Micheletto and her husband. She screamed, she clawed, she clung to the bedposts. But she was a small woman fighting a squad of professional killers. Micheletto's guards grabbed her and Sancha, dragging them physically from the room. Lucrezia was screaming for her father, screaming for God, screaming for mercy. But there was no mercy. The heavy oak doors slammed shut. The bolt slid home. Inside the room, the silence returned. Alfonso of Aragon, the 18-year-old Prince of Naples, was alone with Micheletto Corella. He was weak, bedridden, and unarmed. We do not know the exact words that were exchanged, but we know the method. Micheletto did not use a knife this time. He didn't want the mess. He used his hands. Some sources say he used a pillow to smother the boy. Others, more reliable, say he used the garrote or simply his bare hands to strangle the life out of him. It was a slow, intimate, and terrifying death. Alfonso would have looked up into the eyes of Cesare's henchman, gasping for air, his lungs burning, his bandages tearing as he thrashed in a futile attempt to survive. He was murdered in the very bed where his wife had nursed him, murdered by the order of his brother-in-law under the roof of the Pope. When the silence from the room became absolute, Micheletto unlocked the door. He walked out, calm and professional, as if he had just finished a minor chore. He told the guards that the Duke had fallen out of bed and died of a seizure. It was a lie so transparent, so insulting, that it was almost a joke. Lucrezia rushed back into the room, but it was too late. She found Alfonso dead. His face was purple, his eyes bloodshot, his neck bruised. The struggle was over. The lunch that had begun on the steps of St. Peter's had indeed been finished at dinner. The psychological impact of this moment on Lucrezia Borgia cannot be overstated. This was the moment she broke. For years she had been a pawn, manipulated and moved by her family. But she had maintained a spark of hope. She had believed that she could have a private life, that she could love and be loved. Now, staring at the strangled corpse of her husband, she realized the terrifying truth of her existence. She realized that her love was a curse. She realized that anyone she cared for would be viewed by her father and brother as a threat. She was not a person. She was a possession. And the Borgias did not share their possessions. Her grief was primal. She wept so violently that even the Pope was alarmed. But Cesare watched her grief with the same cold detachment he had shown at Juan's funeral. He didn't care that he had broken his sister's heart. He had removed the rival. He had reasserted his dominance. Alfonso was gone, and Lucrezia belonged to him again. The murder of Alfonso of Aragon was the nadir of the Borgia morality. It wasn't a political assassination. It was a domestic slaughter. It was a crime of pure, unadulterated evil, driven by incestuous jealousy and executed with a cruelty that defies comprehension. It proved that in the Vatican of Alexander VI there was no sanctuary. The bedchamber, the hospital, the church steps, it didn't matter. If the Borgias wanted you dead, you were already a ghost. And as the servants carried Alfonso's body away to be buried in secret, the people of Rome shuddered. They realized that the Holy Family was not just corrupt, they were rabid. And the most dangerous beast in the pack was the one wearing the black mask, the one who had just turned his sister's bedroom into a slaughterhouse. By the autumn of 1501, the House of Borgia had ascended to a plane of existence that was entirely removed from the moral laws of ordinary men. They had survived murder scandals, incest rumors, and political wars, and they had emerged not chastened, but emboldened. They were the untouchable gods of Rome, and on the night of October 31st, All Hallows' Eve, they decided to celebrate their divinity with a ritual that would stain the history of the papacy forever. This event has come to be known as the Banquet of Chestnuts. This was not a secret orgy held in a hidden cellar or a remote villa. It took place in the heart of the Apostolic Palace, in the private apartments of Cesare Borgia, just a few hundred feet from the Sistine Chapel where Michelangelo would soon paint the face of God. It was held on the eve of All Saints' Day, a holy night meant for prayer and reflection. But in the Borgia Vatican, the only spirits being invoked were those of wine and lust. The host of the evening was Cesare Borgia. The guest of honor was his father, Pope Alexander VI. And sitting beside them like a porcelain doll with dead eyes was Lucrezia. The preparations for the night were meticulous. Cesare, ever the strategist, approached pleasure with the same military precision he applied to war. He did not want common streetwalkers for this event. He sent his agents into the city to hire the cortigiane oneste, the honest courtesan. In Renaissance Rome, these women were the celebrities of the underworld. They were not the desperate creatures shivering in the alleys of the Suburra. They were educated, cultured, and breathtakingly beautiful. They could recite poetry in Latin, play the lute, and converse on politics. They dressed in silks and velvets that rivaled the nobility, and they commanded prices that could bankrupt a merchant. Cesare hired 50 of the finest courtesans in Rome, 50 women to serve the pleasure of the vicar of Christ and his family. As the sun set over the Tiber, turning the river to blood red, the carriages began to arrive at the Vatican gates. The Swiss guards, sworn to protect the sanctity of the church, stood at attention and waved them through. They watched as 50 women, draped in expensive cloaks and wearing masks of gold and silver, ascended the marble stairs to the Cesare's apartments. The air was already heavy with the scent of roasted meats and expensive French perfumes. Inside the banquet hall, the scene was one of overwhelming, suffocating opulence. The long tables were laden with gold plate and crystal goblets. The room was illuminated by hundreds of beeswax candles held in massive silver candelabras that cast long flickering shadows against the frescoes on the walls. These frescoes depicted scenes from the Bible, saints, martyrs, and angels looking down in painted judgment. But the eyes of the living guests were focused on the flesh, not the spirit. The dinner began with a deceptive civility. The courtesans were seated among the guests, cardinals, noblemen, and Cesare's trusted officers. Servants moved silently through the room, pouring wine that flowed like water. It was a vintage, dark, and heavy, designed to loosen tongues and lower inhibitions. Laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings, mixing with the soft strumming of lutes. To an outsider, it might have looked like a standard royal banquet, a celebration of wealth and power. But if you looked at the head table, you would have seen the sickness at the heart of the evening. Sitting at the center was Pope Alexander VI. He was 70 years old now, a man whose body was beginning to fail, but whose appetites remained voracious. He sat on a throne-like chair, his heavy robes loosened, his face flushed with wine and anticipation. He didn't look like the spiritual leader of Christendom. He looked like a Roman emperor in the final days of the empire, bloated with excess, watching the spectacle with eyes that glittered with a wet, predatory hunger. He was a man who had blurred the lines between the sacred and the profane until they no longer existed. To his right sat Cesare. The Prince of Shadows was the conductor of this orchestra. He was dressed in black velvet, a stark contrast to the riot of color around him. He drank sparingly. He ate little. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the room, watching the courtesans, watching the cardinals, ensuring that everything was proceeding exactly according to his design. For Cesare, this wasn't just a party. It was a display of dominance. He was showing Rome that he could turn the Vatican into a brothel, and no one would dare to stop him. And to his left sat Lucrezia. Her presence at the banquet of chestnuts is one of the most disturbing details recorded by the chronicler Johann Burchard. She had just buried her husband Alfonso only 2 months prior. The man she loved had been strangled by her brother's henchmen in the room next door. Yet here she was, seated between her father and her brother, the architects of her misery. She was described as being dressed in black, perhaps a subtle nod to her mourning, or perhaps a reflection of the hollowness inside her. She didn't laugh, she didn't eat. She sat like a statue, a beautiful, tragic prop in her family's theater of the grotesque. Her presence validated the event. It signaled that the Borgias were a united front, that the past was forgotten, and that the only thing that mattered was the pleasure of the moment. It was a psychological surrender. She had realized that resistance was futile, and so she had disassociated, turning herself into a spectator of her own life. As the hours passed, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The polite conversation died away, replaced by coarser jokes and louder laughter. The wine had done its work. The cardinals, men who had sworn vows of chastity, were now openly fondling the courtesans. The air grew thick and hot, smelling of sweat, wax, and arousal. The veneer of civilization was cracking, revealing the raw animalistic urges beneath. The food was cleared away. The servants removed the plates of pheasant and wild boar, leaving only the wine. The musicians stopped playing their courtly tunes and switched to a rhythmic, drum-heavy beat that pulsed like a heartbeat. Cesare Borgia stood up. The room went silent. The 50 courtesans looked at him, their painted faces expectant. The cardinals leaned forward in their chairs, wiping grease from their chins. The Pope clapped his hands together like a child waiting for a treat. Cesare gave a signal to his servants. They did not bring out dessert. They did not bring out dancers. Instead, they began to move the heavy silver candelabras. Normally, these candelabras stood on the tables or on tall stands to illuminate the room. But now, under Cesare's orders, the servants placed them on the floor. They arranged them in a chaotic pattern, scattering them across the polished marble tiles. The light shifted. The room was no longer lit from above, but from below, casting monstrous, distorted shadows that danced on the walls. The faces of the guests were suddenly illuminated in a demonic underlight, turning them into gargoyles. Then the servants brought in baskets, large woven baskets filled to the brim with chestnuts. These were not roasted chestnuts meant for eating. They were raw, hard nuts. Cesare nodded, and the servants began to throw the chestnuts onto the floor. They scattered them by the handful, sending them skittering across the marble, rolling between the bases of the candelabras, covering the floor in a carpet of brown shells. The guests watched, confused at first. What was this? A game? A ritual? Cesare looked at the 50 courtesans. He didn't speak a word. He didn't have to. The women knew what they had been paid for. They knew that the honest part of their title ended here. Slowly, one by one, the women began to undo their laces. The heavy velvet dresses fell to the floor. The silk undergarments were untied. Within moments, 50 of the most beautiful women in Rome stood stripped bare in the center of the apostolic palace, their skin glowing in the flickering candlelight of the candelabras at their feet. The Pope leaned forward, his breathing heavy. Lucrezia stared straight ahead, her face a mask of indifference. Cesare sat back, his arms crossed, a cruel smile playing on his lips. The banquet was over. The ballet of the chestnuts was about to begin. The doors were locked, the curtains were drawn. And in the heart of the holy city, on the eve of All Saints, the Vatican was about to descend into a level of depravity that would make the emperors of ancient Rome blush in their graves. The gathering of sins was complete. Now the punishment would begin, not for the sinners, but for the very idea of human dignity. The heavy oak doors were bolted shut. The musicians abandoned their courtly lutes for a low, rhythmic drumming that sounded like the heartbeat of a fevered animal. Under the strange, disorienting underlight of the candelabras placed on the floor, the Vatican was transformed into a chaotic scene from Dante's Inferno. Cesare raised a finger, and the game began. The women dropped to their hands and knees. They were forced to crawl through the maze of open flames, retrieving the scattered chestnuts, while the men cheered them on. 50 of the most cultured, beautiful women in Rome, scrambling on all fours like frantic beetles. They bumped into each other in the confusion. They cried out as the hot wax dripped onto their bare skin. They gasped for breath in the smoky, stifling air near the floor. Dust and chestnut shells clung to their sweating bodies. And from the high table on the dais, the laughter rained down on them like stones. Pope Alexander VI, the 70-year-old vicar of Christ, was laughing the hardest. He leaned over the velvet railing of the dais, his face flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson from the wine and the spectacle. He was not watching this as a detached observer. He was the ringmaster of this circus of degradation. He grabbed handfuls of chestnuts from a silver bowl and threw them onto the floor, aiming for the women, shouting encouragement to the ones who moved the fastest, treating the degradation of human beings as harmless evening entertainment. In his eyes, there was no conflict between his office and his actions. He was the Pope, and therefore whatever amused him was righteous. The sound in the room was a cacophony of shrieks, coarse laughter, the thud of crawling bodies, and the clattering of hard nuts on marble. But beneath the noise, there was a profound screaming silence of the soul. The dignity of the papacy was being strangled on that floor. The frescoes of the saints on the walls, Peter, Paul, the Virgin Mary, painted by the masters of the Renaissance, stared down in mute, painted horror at the spectacle below. The sacred space was being desecrated not by invaders, but by its own guardians. But the chestnut crawl was merely the warm-up act, a way to dehumanize the participants and strip away the last vestiges of modesty. The Borgias had a second act prepared, one that would turn the night from a display of humiliation into a theater of industrial sexual depravity. Once the chestnuts had been gathered and the women were exhausted, sweating, and covered in dust and wax, the nature of the party shifted gears. The male guests, the battle-hardened captains of Cesare's army, the dissolute noblemen, and yes, even members of the clergy who had sworn vows of chastity, descended from the tables like wolves who had been given the signal to feed. Johann Burchard, the German master of ceremonies, whose secret diary provides the only detailed record of this night, writes about what followed with a dry, clinical precision that makes it even more terrifying than if he had used emotional language. He records that the Pope and Cesare turned the orgy into a formal competition. Servants brought out the prizes and displayed them on a long table for everyone to see. There were fine silken tunics embroidered with gold thread, pairs of boots made of soft Spanish leather, velvet hats adorned with ostrich feathers, and heavy purses filled with gold ducats. These were the types of rewards usually given to the winners of jousting tournaments or horse races, celebrating strength and valor. But tonight they were the rewards for a different kind of stamina. The announcement was made to the room. The prizes would be awarded to the men who could perform the sexual act with the courtesans the most times in a single session. The room dissolved into absolute chaos. What followed was not love. It was not even lust in the human, passionate sense. It was mechanical. It was industrial. It was a carnal Olympics held in the home of St. Peter. The courtesans were no longer people. They were equipment, hurdles to be cleared in a race to win a pair of shoes. The men were not lovers. They were competitors, driven by ego, wine, and greed, performing for an audience. The intimacy of the act was ripped away, replaced by a grunting, sweating exertion that was as unromantic as a slaughterhouse. The air grew heavy with the smell of sex, unwashed bodies, and the desperation of the women who had no choice but to endure. And the audience, the judges of this nightmare, was the most disturbing element of all. Sitting in judgment of this contest, tallying the scores, were the three heads of the Borgia dragon, Alexander, Cesare, and Lucrezia. This tableau defines the Borgia sickness. There sat the Pope, the man who held the keys to heaven and hell, acting as the supreme referee of a sex contest. He and Cesare argued over the tally, pointing and debating which man had finished, which man was faking, and who deserved the silk tunic. They were treating the act of creation, the divine spark of life, as a spectator, sport, stripping it of all mystery and emotion until it was just friction and sweat. It was the ultimate blasphemy, far worse than any heresy spoken from a pulpit. And then there was Lucrezia. Burchard's diary explicitly places her there. Lucrezia B. is listed as one of the judges who handed out the prizes. This detail is the final knife in the heart of anyone who wants to see her solely as an innocent victim. She was 21 years old. She was a widow of only 2 months. Her husband, the man she loved, had been strangled in the room next door by the order of the brother sitting beside her. And yet, here she was. She held a pair of silk shoes in her lap. She watched men use women on the floor. She awarded the winners with a smile. What was going through her mind? Was she forced to be there? Likely. Cesare's control over her was absolute. But was she dissociated? Almost certainly. To survive the trauma of her life, Lucrezia had likely retreated deep inside herself, turning her face into a porcelain mask. She had become a spectator of her own existence. But the image remains, the golden-haired princess, the face of Rome, participating in the degradation of her own gender. In that room, on that night, Lucrezia Borgia was not a hostage. She was an accomplice. The Borgias had finally succeeded in dragging her down into the mud with them. They had normalized the abnormal. They had taught her that this sweating, grunting, loveless pile of bodies was what power looked like. They had broken her moral compass so thoroughly that she could no longer tell north from south. The competition went on for hours, stretching into the deepest part of the night. The candles burned low, sputtering in pools of wax, casting long, dying shadows across the heaving mass of humanity on the floor. The floor was slick with spilled wine and bodily fluids. The laughter of the Pope turned into the heavy, wheezing breathing of an old man exhausted by excitement. The musicians played on, their fingers bleeding, their eyes averted from the horror in front of them. Finally, as the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the heavy velvet curtains, the dance of the damned came to a ragged end. The winners were announced. The silk tunics and leather boots were handed out by Lucrezia's pale hands. The courtesans, bruised, exhausted, their knees raw from the marble, their eyes hollow and vacant, gathered their torn dresses. They stumbled out of the apostolic palace and into the cool, misty morning air of the Vatican gardens. They were paid their gold, but they left behind their dignity and their souls on that marble floor. They walked past the Swiss guards, who stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the parade of shame leaving the Pope's apartments. Inside the room, the servants moved silently to clean up the wreckage. They swept away the crushed chestnut shells. They scrubbed the fluids from the floor. They opened the windows to let out the fetid stench of the night and let in the bells ringing for morning mass. The physical evidence was removed, but the stain remained. Some stains cannot be scrubbed away with water and lie. The banquet of chestnuts was the moment the House of Borgia crossed a line from which there was no return. Before this night, their crimes could be explained away as the brutal necessities of politics. Murdering a rival is ruthless, but intelligible. Marrying for power is cynical, but common. But this was madness. This was the behavior of people who believed they were exempt from the human condition. They had turned the Vatican into a trough. They had mocked the very religion they led. They had proven that for them, other human beings were merely toys to be broken and discarded. When the rumors of the banquet leaked out, and they did leak, carried by the traumatized servants and the courtesans into every tavern and market in Rome, the people stopped calling Alexander VI a bad pope. They started using a different word. They started calling him the Antichrist. They whispered that the Borgias were not just corrupt, they were a demonic sect that had seized the throne of God. They believed that God would not let this stand. They believed that lightning would strike the Vatican and burn it to the ground for this abomination. And they were right. The lightning was coming. But it wouldn't come from the sky. It would come from a small white powder that Cesare kept in his ring. The party was over. The hangover was about to begin. And in the House of Borgia, the hangover is usually fatal. The dawn of All Saints' Day rose over a Vatican that had lost its soul, and the rot was now too deep to cure. By the summer of 1502, the scandals of the House of Borgia had evolved from the hot, passionate violence of the sword to the cold, calculated science of the vial. The banquet of chestnuts had established their moral bankruptcy, but it was their financial bankruptcy that necessitated a new form of terror. Cesare Borgia's wars in the Romagna were incredibly expensive. Mercenaries needed to be paid, cannons needed to be cast, and alliances needed to be bought. The papal treasury, though vast, was not bottomless, and the extravagant lifestyle of the Vatican, the parties, the mistresses, the silks, had drained the coffers dry. The Borgias needed a new source of revenue, and they found it in the very men who sat beside them in the consistory, the cardinals. In Renaissance Rome, a cardinal was not just a priest, he was a prince of the church, often possessing immense personal wealth, vast estates and palaces filled with gold and art. Under church law, when a cardinal died, his property technically reverted to the Holy See, especially if he died intestate, or if the Pope decided to enforce obscure, ancient rites. Alexander VI and Cesare realized that the richest men in Rome were walking piggy banks, and the only way to smash them open was to ensure they died. But you cannot simply behead a cardinal in St. Peter's Square without causing a war. You need a weapon that is subtle, a weapon that mimics natural causes, a weapon that allows the victim to linger long enough to sign a last will and testament in favor of the Pope. You need Cantarella. Cantarella is the most infamous substance in the history of toxicology, the liquor of succession, the powder of inheritance. While modern historians debate its exact chemical composition, the legends and the contemporary accounts paint a picture of a substance that was as much alchemy as it was chemistry. It was said to be a variation of arsenic, but refined to a terrifying degree of purity. The recipe, whispered in the dark corners of apothecary shops, involved a grotesque process. A pig would be slaughtered and its internal organs sprinkled with arsenic. The meat would be left to rot and putrefy, allowing the arsenic to blend with the decaying biological matter, creating a concentrated toxic sludge. This sludge was then dried, ground into a fine white powder, and refined until it was indistinguishable from sugar. The genius of Cantarella lay in its physical properties. It was odorless, it was colorless when dissolved, and, most crucially, it had a pleasant, slightly sweet taste. In an era where food was heavily spiced to mask the taste of spoilage, a pinch of Cantarella in a goblet of wine or a dusting of it over a plate of figs was undetectable. It was the perfect assassin. It could walk through any door, bypass any guard, and kiss the victim on the lips without them ever knowing they had been struck. But the true horror of Cantarella was not in how it killed, but in how long it took to kill. Unlike the garrote of Micheletto Corella, which snuffed out a life in seconds, Cantarella was designed for the slow burn. The Borgias did not want their victims to drop dead at the dinner table. That was too messy, too suspicious, and it didn't allow time for the legal paperwork. They wanted a death that looked like Roman fever, the malaria that swept the city every summer. They wanted a death that came in stages. The dying process of a victim of Cantarella is a study in body horror. It begins innocuously, perhaps a few hours after dinner. The victim feels a slight unease in the stomach, a heaviness, perhaps a touch of nausea. They dismiss it as indigestion from a rich meal. But then the fire begins. The arsenic begins to attack the lining of the stomach and the intestines, causing a burning sensation that feels like swallowing hot coals. The vomiting starts, violent, uncontrollable retching that purges the body of fluids. This is followed by a relentless, bloody diarrhea. As the days pass, the dehydration sets in. The skin turns gray and papery, pulling tight against the skull, giving the victim the appearance of a living mummy. The throat swells, making it impossible to swallow water to quench the raging thirst. The hair begins to fall out in clumps. Lesions and boils erupt on the skin, weeping fluids. But the cruelest aspect of arsenic poisoning is that it does not affect the mind until the very end. The victim remains fully conscious, trapped in a disintegrating body, lucid enough to feel every moment of their own decomposition. This window of lucidity was exactly what the Borgias needed. While the cardinal lay dying in his bed, surrounded by doctors who were often in the Pope's pocket, the grief-stricken Alexander VI, or Cesare, would visit. They would express their sorrow, offer prayers, and then, gently, bring up the matter of the estate. They would suggest that, to ensure the salvation of his soul, the dying man should sign over his assets to the church. Terrified of hell and often delirious with pain, the victim would sign the papers. The moment the signature was dry, the treatment would stop, and the death would follow shortly. This method became so efficient that a dark cloud of paranoia descended over Rome. The term the Cup of Borgia became a euphemism for a death sentence. The atmosphere in the Vatican dining halls transformed from conviviality to terror. To receive an invitation to dine with the Pope was no longer an honor. It was a source of dread. Cardinals would feign illness to avoid attending. Those who were forced to go would bring their own servants, their own wine, and even their own food, refusing to touch anything served by the papal kitchen. But Cesare was creative. If you didn't eat the food, the poison might be on the knife. If you didn't drink the wine, it might be in the water. There were rumors that they dusted the poison on the keys to the victim's room, or even on the petals of flowers. The fear was palpable. The chroniclers of the time describe a city where the rich lived in a state of constant siege within their own palaces. The summer heat of Rome, usually a time of lethargy, became the dying season. Every morning the people of Rome would wake up and ask, "Who died last night?" And almost every week a wealthy cardinal, a rich bishop, or a troublesome nobleman would succumb to a sudden fever. The most famous example of this economy of murder was the death of Cardinal Michel. He was the nephew of a previous pope, immensely wealthy, and a man who had been loyal to the Borgias. But loyalty has an expiration date when the coffers are empty. One morning, Cardinal Michel felt a little unwell after a breakfast, prepared by his trusted steward. By that evening, he was in the throes of the fire in the gut. He lingered for 2 days, just long enough to receive the last rites from the Pope himself. The moment Cardinal Michel breathed his last, the mass dropped. Cesare Borgia did not even wait for the body to be cold. He sent Micheletto Corella and his troops to the cardinal's palace. They stripped it bare. They took the gold plate, the tapestries, the furniture, and the chests of coins. They tore the rings off the dead man's fingers. It was a state-sanctioned looting, a robbery committed by the government against its own officials. The wealth of Cardinal Michel flowed directly into the war chest of Cesare Borgia, funding his siege engines and his mercenaries. This was the science of death perfected. It was efficient, it was profitable, and it was terrifying. But it also created a peculiar psychological environment for the killers themselves. Pope Alexander VI and Cesare were living in a world where they were the only predators, and everyone else was prey. They began to believe in their own invincibility. They believed they had mastered the art of death, that they could control it, dose it, and direct it like a stream of water. However, playing with poison is a dangerous game. When you live in a house filled with vials of white powder, where the servants are bribed and the cooks are assassins, the line between the hunter and the hunted begins to blur. The Borgias had created a monster, a culture of poisoning that was permeating the very air of the Vatican. They had normalized treachery to such an extent that trust was extinct. By the summer of 1503, the heat in Rome was oppressive, the worst in living memory. The malaria mosquitoes were swarming from the marshes, and the cup of Borgia was working overtime. Cesare was at the height of his power, preparing for his final conquest of Tuscany. The Pope was confident, planning a new series of inheritances to fund the campaign. They felt untouchable. But fate, or perhaps divine justice, has a sense of irony. They had spent years perfecting the recipe for Cantarella. They knew exactly how much to use, how to hide it, and how to wait for the result. But the thing about powder is that it all looks the same. And the thing about treachery is that it breeds treachery. As August 1503 approached, the stage was set for the final catastrophic dinner party. The table was laid, the wine was poured, and the science of death was about to conduct its final, most shocking experiment. The Borgias were about to learn that when you drink from the cup of demons, eventually you swallow the dregs. The atmosphere in Rome had turned fetid. The stench of the Tiber, the rotting garbage in the streets, and the metaphorical rot of the Vatican morality had combined into a miasma of doom. The people whispered that the devil was coming to collect his due. They didn't know that the devil was already sitting at the table holding a goblet of wine, smiling at his son, unaware that the white powder dissolving in the dark liquid was not meant for the guest, but for the host. The era of the Borgias was rushing toward its climax, not on the battlefield, but in the dining room. The summer of 1503 descended upon Rome not like a season, but like a biblical plague. It was the hottest August in living memory, a stifling, breathless heat that turned the eternal city into a kiln. The Tiber River, low and sluggish, stank of sewage and rotting fish, while clouds of mosquitoes rose from the marshes, bringing with them the Roman fever, the malaria that killed indiscriminately. But inside the Vatican, a different kind of fever was burning. It was the fever of final ambition. Cesare Borgia, now the master of the Romagna, was preparing for his ultimate conquest of Tuscany. Pope Alexander VI, confident and invincible, was scheming to seize the wealth of yet another rich churchman to fund his son's army. They felt untouchable, masters of life and death who had bent the world to their will, but they had forgotten the oldest rule of the game they were playing. When you dine with the devil, you must use a long spoon, and eventually the devil comes to collect his debt. On the evening of August 5th, 1503, the Pope and Cesare accepted an invitation to dine at the villa of Cardinal Adriano Castellesi. It was meant to be a pleasant garden supper held outdoors to catch the evening breeze, but the invitation was a death sentence. Cardinal Castellesi was immensely wealthy, and the Borgias had decided that his time was up. The plan was classic in its simplicity. They would bring their own wine, a special vintage laced with the white powder of Cantarella. They would ensure the cardinal drank from the poison bottle, wait for him to die of malaria a few days later, and then confiscate his fortune. It was a routine operation, a piece of administrative murder they had performed a dozen times before. But fate, which had favored the Borgias for a decade, suddenly turned its face away. The sequence of events that followed is a comedy of errors, so black it could only be written by history itself. The Pope and Cesare arrived early at the villa, exhausted and parched from the oppressive heat. The servants bustling to set up the tables were disorganized. The butler, who had been entrusted with the poisoned wine and who knew exactly which bottle was which, was temporarily absent or distracted. Pope Alexander VI, sweating in his heavy robes, demanded a drink immediately. Cesare, too, asked for wine to quench his thirst. A servant, seeing the bottle of expensive vintage that the Borgias had brought with them, assumed it was the best wine reserved for the Pope's personal enjoyment. Innocent of the plot, the servant uncorked the bottle of Cantarella and poured 2 large goblets. The father and the son, the 2 most dangerous men in Europe, raised their cups. They looked at each other, perhaps shared a toast to their coming victory, and drank deep. They swallowed the very death they had prepared for another. The reaction was not immediate. Arsenic takes time, but within hours the chaos began. The party was abandoned. The Pope and Cesare were rushed back to the Vatican, their bodies already beginning to revolt. The fire in the gut that they had inflicted on so many others now ignited in their own stomachs. The irony was absolute. The hunters had become the prey of their own trap. For the next 2 weeks, the apostolic palace was transformed into a house of horrors. The Pope, 72 years old and obese, had no defense against the massive dose of poison he had ingested. His decline was a slow, agonizing descent into hell. The symptoms were horrific. He vomited continuously, his body purging itself of fluids until he was dehydrated. His stomach burned as if he had swallowed molten lead, but the physical pain was matched by the psychological terror. As the fever spiked, Alexander VI began to hallucinate. Servants whispered that in his delirium the Pope was screaming at invisible figures. He saw a large black dog running around his room, a symbol of the devil. He saw the faces of the men he had murdered. He saw the ghost of Ferranti of Naples and the specter of Savonarola, the monk he had burned at the stake. The man who had mocked God for 11 years was now facing the terrifying prospect of judgment. He writhed in his bed, gasping for air, begging for a relief that would not come. On August 18, 1503, Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, finally breathed his last. But the horror did not end with his death. It merely entered a new grotesque phase. The decomposition of the Pope's body was immediate and unnatural, a phenomenon that terrified those who witnessed it. Due to the poison and the extreme summer heat, the corpse began to putrefy within hours. Detailed accounts from the master of ceremonies describe a scene of nightmare. The Pope's body swelled up like a sponge soaking up water. His face became black, like the color of a mulberry or the darkest cloth. His tongue, swollen to twice its normal size, protruded from his mouth, filling it completely. His abdomen distended until it looked like a ball ready to burst. He became so wide that he lost all human shape, transforming into a sphere of rotting flesh. And the smell was a physical wall that hit anyone who tried to enter the room. It was the stench of sulfur and advanced decay, so overpowering that the guards had to cover their faces with vinegar-soaked cloths just to stand near the door. The burial of Alexander VI was the final humiliating punchline to his life of excess. When the undertakers arrived with the coffin, they found that the body had swollen so much that it would not fit. The Pope was too wide for his final resting place, but the stench was so bad and the fear of the corpse so great that there was no time to build a new one. What happened next is a scene of pure Gothic horror. The 2 undertakers, gagging from the smell, removed the Pope's mitre and his opulent robes. They wrapped the bloated black body in an old piece of carpet. Then one man stood on the coffin lid, while the other used his fists and feet to physically punch and kick the Pope's body into the box. They shoved his shoulders down. They forced his knees up, crushing his limbs to make him fit. There was no dignity, no prayer, no incense. Just the sound of cracking bones and the grunts of men trying to dispose of a monster. The most powerful man in the world was mashed into his coffin like garbage and hastily dragged into the crypt. The devil had indeed paid his debts, and the currency was total humiliation. But while the father rotted, the son lived. And this is where the tragedy of the Borgias turns from grotesque to pathetic. Cesare Borgia had survived the poison. His youth, his strength, and perhaps the fact that he had watered down his wine saved his life. But he was not unscathed. While his father was dying in the room next door, Cesare was fighting a battle for his own existence that was equally horrific. To save him, his doctors used the most extreme medical treatments of the time. They believed that to draw the poison out, they had to immerse him in the blood and heat of a living thing. They brought a live mule into the Vatican apartments. They slaughtered the animal, slit its belly open, and while the carcass was still steaming and thrashing, they stripped Cesare naked and stuffed him inside the mule's body. He was forced to lie there, encased in the blood and guts of the animal, effectively steaming in its dying heat. When that didn't work, they plunged him into baths of ice water to break the fever. The shock to his system was immense. His skin began to peel off in great sheets. His face, already scarred by syphilis, became a raw red mask. He lay in his bed, skinless, shivering, vomiting, drifting in and out of consciousness. And this was the ultimate tragedy of Cesare Borgia. He had planned for everything. He once told Machiavelli that he had considered every possible political scenario that could happen upon his father's death, and had a plan for each one. He had the army ready to seize Rome. He had the cardinals bribed to elect a puppet pope. He had the strongholds secured. "I had thought of everything," Cesare later whispered, "except that I myself would be dying at the same time as him." It was a failure of timing, a cosmic joke played by fortune. At the exact moment when he needed to be on his horse, commanding his troops, terrorizing the conclave, and securing his inheritance, Cesare was lying in a bath of ice, too weak to lift a finger. While the wolf lay helpless, the sheep turned into lions. The cardinals he had terrorized, the families he had crushed, they all returned with a vengeance, stripping the Borgias of their conquests piece by piece. The enemies of the Borgias, who had been hiding in exile, smelled the blood in the water. They knew the lion was dead and the wolf was crippled. The Orsini, the Colonna, and the rival cardinals began to pour back into Rome. They roused the mob. They attacked the Vatican. The Borgia influence began to evaporate like water on a hot stone. Cesare lay in his darkened room, listening to the bells tolling for his father's death, knowing that every ring was a countdown to his own destruction. He was alive, yes, but his power had died with Alexander. He was no longer the Prince of Shadows. He was just a sick man in a room full of stolen gold that he could no longer protect. The empire of the Borgias, built on murder, incest, and poison, did not end with a great war. It ended with a mistake at a dinner party. It ended with a bloated corpse stuffed into a box and a skinless man shivering in the dark. The house of cards had collapsed and the wind was beginning to blow the wreckage away. The death of Pope Alexander VI in the sweltering August of 1503 was not just the end of a life, it was the detonation of the foundation upon which the House of Borgia stood. The shockwave leveled the political landscape of Italy overnight. For Cesare Borgia, the Prince of Shadows, the aftermath was a descent into a nightmare from which he would never wake. He lay in his bed in the Vatican, his skin raw and peeling from the effects of the poison, listening to the mobs chanting death to the Borgias outside the palace walls. He had the soldiers, he had the gold, and he had the plan, but he did not have the one thing that had made him invincible, his father's authority. Without the Pope's signature, Cesare was just a bandit warlord occupying the apostolic palace. The final nail in his coffin came in the form of a man named Giuliano della Rovere. For a decade, della Rovere had been the Borgia's bitterest enemy, living in exile, spitting venom at the Spanish Marranos who had usurped the throne of St. Peter. Now he returned to Rome as the new Pope, Julius II. In a moment of fatal miscalculation, perhaps due to the lingering fog of the poison, Cesare believed he could manipulate this old enemy. He gave Julius the votes of the Spanish cardinals in exchange for a promise that he would remain captain general. It was the only time Cesare trusted a man he should have killed, and it was the mistake that finished him. Julius II took the votes, took the tiara, and then, with a cold smile, broke his word. He stripped Cesare of his titles, arrested him, and threw him into the dungeons of the very castle that had once been the Borgia stronghold. Cesare was cast down from the heights of Olympus to the depths of a prison cell. He was exiled to Spain, the land of his ancestors, and locked in the castle of La Moda, a fortress perched on a high, windswept cliff considered escape-proof. For 2 years, the man who had terrified kings stared at the same stone walls, watching the seasons change through a slit in the masonry. But a wolf does not domesticate, it waits. On a dark night in 1506, Cesare staged a desperate breakout that reads like an action movie. He bribed a servant to smuggle in a rope. He climbed out of the window of the highest tower, descending into the abyss, but the rope was too short. Dangling in the darkness, hundreds of feet above the moat, he heard the guards discovering his escape. He had no choice. He let go. He fell through the black air, crashing onto the hard earth below. He shattered bones in his legs and ribs, but the adrenaline of the predator took over. He dragged his broken body to a waiting horse and rode into the night, vanishing into the kingdom of Navarre. But the Cesare Borgia who emerged from that prison was not the same man. He was a broken shadow of the prince. His face was ravaged by syphilis, forcing him to wear the mask constantly. His body was stiff with healed fractures. He had no army, no money, and no pope. All he had was his rage. He took service as a mercenary for his brother-in-law, the King of Navarre, fighting in petty squabbles over small towns. It was a humiliating come-down for a man who had once drawn lines on the map of Italy and called them his own. The end came on March 12th, 1507, in a muddy field outside the small town of Viana. It was a skirmish so minor it barely deserved a footnote in history. Cesare, leading a charge, was ambushed. His men fled, but Cesare did not. Perhaps he sought death. Perhaps he believed even then in his own immortality. He charged into a group of enemy soldiers alone, screaming defiance. They dragged him from his horse and fell upon him with a savagery reserved for a hated beast. They stabbed him 25 times. When the dust settled, the soldiers stripped the body of its expensive armor and fine clothes, leaving it stripped in the mud. They didn't know who he was, they just saw a corpse. When his few remaining squires found him hours later, they saw a sight that encapsulated the ultimate tragedy of ambition. The most feared man in Christendom, the son of a pope, lay exposed on the blood-soaked earth, his hand modestly covering his genitals, with only a rough stone placed over his modesty by a passerby. The famous motto he had engraved on his sword, "Out Caesar, out nihil," either Caesar or nothing, had finally been answered. He was nothing. But while the wolf died in the mud, the pawn survived. The story of Lucrezia Borgia is the great unexpected twist of the family saga. When the Borgia Empire collapsed in 1503, Lucrezia was far away in the north, safe in the city of Ferrara. She was the Duchess now, married to Alfonso d'Este. Her father was dead, her brother was in prison, and her name was synonymous with incest and murder. The world expected her to wither and die, or to be cast aside by her husband. But Lucrezia did something extraordinary. She reinvented herself. Free from the suffocating influence of her father and the terrifying love of her brother, Lucrezia blossomed. She revealed a talent for governance that she had never been allowed to show in Rome. She managed the finances of Ferrara. She presided over the courts of law. She navigated the treacherous waters of Italian politics with a grace that disarmed her critics. She became a patron of the arts, surrounding herself with the greatest poets and thinkers of the age, including Pietro Bembo and Ludovico Ariosto. They did not write of her as a poisoner. They wrote of her as a muse, a woman of intelligence and kindness. She washed the blood from the Borgia name. She became deeply pious, wearing a hair shirt under her silk dresses as penance for the sins of her family. She founded convents and hospitals, caring for the poor and the sick. The people of Ferrara, who had initially feared her arrival, grew to love her. They called her the Mother of the People. She had survived the fire of the Vatican and emerged as refined gold. Yet the sadness never left her eyes. She kept a small portrait of Cesare in her private room, and she mourned him when the news of his death reached her, weeping for the brother who had loved her too much and destroyed her happiness. She lived for 12 more years after the fall of her family, dying in 1519 at the age of 39 due to complications from childbirth, the tragic common fate of women in her era. But she died surrounded by a husband who respected her in a city that adored her. She was the only Borgia to find peace. The true legacy of this cursed family lies in the mind of a Florentine diplomat who watched Cesare Borgia closely during his rise. Niccolò Machiavelli saw in Cesare the perfect archetype of the ruler he described in his masterpiece, The Prince. He saw a man who was not bound by Christian morality, a man who understood that power is a physics of its own, requiring cruelty, deception, and force. Cesare Borgia became the model for the modern political animal, the leader who does what is necessary, not what is good. The House of Borgia was the first true crime family. They were the godfathers of the Renaissance. They showed us the terrifying potential of human ambition when it is stripped of conscience. They were beautiful, they were brilliant, and they were monstrous. They represented the peak of the Renaissance spirit, the desire to consume the world, to make it one's own, to defy God and man in the pursuit of glory. In the end, their story is a warning. It is a testament to the fact that you can buy the papacy, you can conquer armies, and you can poison your enemies, but you cannot outrun the consequences of your own nature. Today, if you visit the Vatican, you can walk through the Borgia apartments. The rooms are dark, the frescoes are shadowed, and the air feels different there, cooler, heavier. You can see the face of Lucrezia painted as a saint on the walls, looking down with her hazel eyes. You can see the symbol of the bull, the Borgia crest, stamped into the ceiling. They are gone. The poison cups are broken. The garrots are rusted. The screams have faded, but the legend remains. It is a story written in blood and gold, a story of a father, a son, and a daughter who tried to touch the sun, and in doing so, burned the world around them. The wolf is dead. The Duchess is sleeping. And the silence of the Borgias speaks louder than their cannons ever did.